As an invested partner to the swine industry and the people behind it, Merck Animal Health is dedicated to supporting you and the well-being of your operation now and in the future, working right alongside you to help address your challenges. Our prevention-centric focus provides greater possibilities for profitability through healthier pigs, improved animal welfare, and unrivaled support in a quickly evolving marketplace. Merck Animal Health, driven by prevention.
We're going to go ahead and get started with our second speaker of the afternoon. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. David Meeker. David is the Senior Vice President of the North American Renders Association. He serves as their advisor on science, regulatory, and animal health issues. He is also Research Director for the Fats and Protein Research Foundation. He previously served in scientific and management positions at the National Pork Producers Council and National Turkey Federation. He was a staff director at the National Academy of Sciences and an associate professor at the Ohio State University. He has advised numerous governmental, professional, and business organizations. He received his BS, MS, PhD, and MBA degrees, all from Iowa State University in animal science, breeding, and agribusiness. The floor is all yours.
Thank you. Before I start, I'm going to tell a little story about Diane. I came in here at lunchtime just to get the lay of the land, and she was sitting here having her lunch, and I assumed she was the moderator. So I said, I'll be your second speaker. And she says, well, I hope this first speaker shows up and he's pretty good, so you don't have to bring alive a crowd. So you did great, and it was a very nice job. I set foot on this campus 52 years ago. This building wasn't here yet, and Hilton Coliseum was just being finished up. So part of my resume that was read is left off. I spent 10 years working for Iowa State, managing one of the swine research farms. So I have a long history here. Thanks for staying. Most everybody came to see Diane and then took off, but I think you'll be rewarded with a few things you didn't know about rendering. Just a little bit about our association that pays my salary. NARA is the International Trade Association that represents the rendering, more than 90% of the rendering industry in both the U.S. and Canada. And our members include independent renders, or sometimes called street renders. They're the ones that go around to butcher shops and grocery stores and pick up old meat, and they're also probably the ones that do dead stock collections on Iowa farms. But we also represent the packers, JBS, Smithfield, Cargill. They're all members as well, and that's where a bulk of the raw materials come from. Our association also manages the Fats and Proteins Research Foundation. FPRF is a mouthful for me, but I'm the research director there as well. What I'm going to go through today, some of it fairly quickly, but I'll talk about how rendering greatly increases the sustainability of meat production. So part of the sustainability story for beef, pork, and chicken is how the byproducts are used. So we'll go through how that is done, how it's made safe, and how we make ingredients for animal feed and pet food. We also are providing biofuel feedstocks out of the fats. Many areas of the country do not have dead stock services, but Iowa fortunately has pretty good options for dead stock pickup. And that can be done and should be done in a very biosecure way to protect herd health. I know all firms don't do it that way, but we have some recommendations on that front. Just a little bit about the size of our industry. There's about 170 plants across the U.S. and 10 in Canada. That's really not that many. They tend to be located in heavy livestock areas. It's about a $10 billion industry. With prices now, it's probably double that because it's very dependent on commodity prices, and our protein meals compete with soybean meal, and our fats compete with both corn and crude oil. So the markets fluctuate. There's about 62 billion pounds of raw material each year in the U.S. and Canada. About 56 billion pounds of that is U.S. material, and that's a lot of truckloads of guts and bones and various other pieces and parts every day. This is the both kinds of plants. We have meat packers with their own rendering and independent renders scattered across the U.S., and you can see a nice concentration wherever you would see a pig population. So it's a pretty good relationship we have with pork producers. Many people don't realize, but somewhere around half of every live animal raised for food, be it a feedlot steer or a market hog or a chicken or turkey, somewhere between 40 and 50% of every live animal is not used for human food. So that has to be taken care of. It has to be made safe. It has to be made into good products in order for the industry to be sustainable. And again, that's about 56 billion pounds of raw material each year in the U.S. The future is bright. All the different projections you might see. This one I think came from CattleFax and is an all meat graph. But the U.S. is a particularly good place to make meat, to raise livestock of all kinds, and projected growth for the future is quite good. So that 62 billion pounds that I talk about for both our countries, about 90% of it's U.S. and about 10% Canada, really results in three things. We boil off the water, which is about 60%, and what's left is about half fat and about half protein. So the protein supplements are used for livestock, poultry, and pets, and the tallow, lard, and other fats are used for, hopefully, pet food and animal feed, but increasingly in recent years for biofuel as well. The raw materials are offal, what's left over from slaughtering an animal for meat, the bones and fat that are trimmed off, blood, feathers, DOAs, they call them, that die on the way to the slaughter plant or on the farms. Many of our independent renders or street renders also collect used cooking oil from all the McDonald's, Wendy's, Safeways, whatever, that process food, and some of the meat processing plants make pre-cooked bacon. All of that grease is collected as well, and a lot of that's going to biodiesel now, but that also can be a competitor for corn for an energy supplement for feed. Recalled meat and outdated retail meat that I mentioned before, and butcher shop scratch. All of these things are raw materials. It all doesn't go in every product. Pet food companies, for instance, only want the top couple things. They don't want dead stock, they don't want UCO, they don't want old meat. So many of our lines are specialized for the customers, and some of our best customers are pet food companies. If you're a render, this is a pretty nice looking picture, but it takes that kind of stuff, which is premium raw material, and makes more nicer pictures when it's finished. A few more examples from members' websites where it looks like good stuff. So as I said, pet food is a big customer. All the different livestocks can utilize we have one of the national experts right here, Brian Kerr, has worked on much of the nutrition research to utilize rendered products in many of these different nutritional situations. I mentioned biofuel. Many organic fertilizers are made from meat and bone meal, and some of the fats go to oleochemical, where they'll break down the fat into glycerin, fatty acids, and use it in cosmetics, lipstick, lotions, and all kinds of things in the oleochemical realm. I won't spend much time on this. It's just a schematic that gives a lot of detail on what I just said, but there's many different pathways, and virtually everything but the squeal becomes some kind of product from the meat animals and the pigs that go to market. So in summary of that, rendered ingredients for animal food make animal agriculture more sustainable because a certain amount of cropland is saved by using these feed ingredients instead of land to make more crops. It reduces food waste by repurposing these byproducts, provides U.S.-based jobs. This stuff has to be done fairly local to where it's created, because it spoils fast and it has to be done quickly. So these are home-based jobs. And if you're making meat, if you're killing pigs to make meat, you have to do something with those byproducts. So some of the smaller operations might landfill it or bury it or try to burn it. And all of those other disposal methods generate much more greenhouse gas than does rendering. Some about our process. Some of them are the old-fashioned ones, and a few of them are still in operation, are batch, so they're just giant automobile-sized pressure cookers, just like the one that you might have at home. But more often now, they're continuous flow, computer-operated, very sophisticated, huge machines in the picture here. All of them will reach minimum temperatures of 245, and some of them cook up to 290 if they're bigger chunks and harder things to break down, like a beef bone. And I'll show you later some data that all of these temperatures are much higher than what is needed for food safety. So all of the bacteria, viruses, protozoa, parasites, all the pathogens we worry about are taken care of in the rendering process. Another schematic, it's in all our materials, but it's a pretty basic process. You take, whether it's a whole carcass or bones or whatever it is, it goes through a sizing process to make it small enough to cook. It goes through the cooker. Out of the cooker, the fat is pressed out from the solids, and then the solids are dried and ground into a meal that looks kind of like brown sugar or some of those examples I showed you. And the fat can be cleaned up to the nth degree through a centrifuge process or less or so, depending on the use it's going to. We have something that I started 17 years ago when I went to work there. As she mentioned, I worked for National Pork Producers, and when I was there, we started the Pork Quality Assurance Program. So when I went to Renders, we started something very similar called the Rendering Code of Practice. It's a HACCP-based program of teaching people how to do good manufacturing, how to do process controls and training. And then in recent years, the government thought that was such a great idea, they made it all mandatory. So we were luckily ahead of the game, doing all the same kinds of things, but FSMA, we call it, Food Safety Modernization Act, really was a big deal for the entire feed industry. All the different ingredients have to do it. A complete feed has to do it. It was passed 11 years ago, almost by Congress, signed into law by President Obama, and it took several years for FDA to promulgate all these extensive regulations. And it really makes rendering, along with some other things that happened in the distant past, makes rendering the most scrutinized, most inspected of all the different producers of feed ingredients. And our industry is really good at complying with all these regulations. So back when we did our first HACCP plan, our code of practice, we started process controls, and those are our cooking temperatures. So every plant has a minimum temperature that they must reach. Actually, these computerized cookers, they have a minimum release temperature. And if anything happens, if the power goes off, if anything happens, if that temperature is not reached, the exit valve closes and the product doesn't leave. So it is almost impossible to have undercooked product. FSMA requires us to validate this cooking step. I mean, they've been doing this for 100 years, so we knew that cooking worked, but we then had to do research to prove it. This little chart here is something we did at Clemson. It's actually a failed experiment. We were going to contaminate different raw materials that get rendered on purpose with salmonella, and then we were going to raise the temperature on that, find out what temperature salmonella got killed. So they contaminated the product, and they wanted to start zero at the lowest cooker temperature. And when we got to the lowest cooker temperature, it was already all dead. So we had to do different experiments to actually get the D values and Z values. But it really was pretty good news that these pathogens are killed very, very early in the rendering process. And we did more extensive studies at Texas Tech, Texas A&M, Colorado State, and also Clemson to do all this validation research And we have white papers that we provide our members and customers whenever they need it. So we had a series of GMPs, and then when they passed the law, they renamed it to CGMPs, current good manufacturing practices that are required. We were already doing most of these, and then we added what we needed to. But you have GMPs for personnel. A lot of the things that Diane talked about in the last talk, we do as far as personnel. There are plant and grounds rules, sanitation, water, equipment, calibration of temperature sensors, and all those sorts of things. So the CGMP list that's required by law is very similar to the GMPs that we've been doing for a while. We released a study early last year, just before the pandemic, we'd worked on for several months with a firm here in Des Moines, an commercial economics firm, but we tried to get data on the entire industry, how much materials we do to validate that number. I keep throwing around 62 billion pounds. We wanted to get data to prove that. We wanted to get data on where the markets are, how things are done, and how much are done, and how much is used in pet food, and how many acres we actually replace. I mentioned the sustainability and the replacement of a certain amount of soybeans and corn. So we did all these calculations. We have all this data extensively on our website, but it's a considerable amount of materials that help our sustainability numbers. Pet food's a growing customer, a big customer, and we do a lot of work with the Pet Food Institute and other research institutions to make sure that byproducts remain in good standing as far as pet food manufacture. I'm going to talk some about the collection and rendering of fallen stock or dead stock. This part of the talk, I don't give that often. I give to producer groups and USDA. I gave one similar to USDA last year by Zoom. This is the first meeting I haven't done by Zoom in 16 months, so I'm really happy to be here. But I talked about some of this stuff for USDA on an African swine fever planning task force. I'm on a couple of them. And someone on the planning group here heard it and wanted me to relay some of this information to you guys, so that's why I'm here. But rendering is a pretty good option if you have that option, like Iowa does. Other states like Oregon that don't have the option really want to get it, and it's hard to get a plant built, but we're working on it in a couple places. But the rendering process really does help to break the disease cycle, because that process I talked about, that kills the pathogens. So that's better than having a carcass laying out in the pasture or behind the barn or wherever sometimes they end up. So it helps break disease cycles. And it can be done safely. Now, I remember, I said it was 52 years since I came to Iowa State, and before that I was on a pig farm in Iowa. And National Byproducts would come and pick up our dead pigs, and there was nothing biosecure about that because they were right by the barn, and the stuff was falling out of the truck, and more stuff was going on the truck, and just a mess. But that's not the way it should be done. I'm sure it's still done that way in a couple places, but there are ways to do the process better and to use what we know about biosecurity to make dead animal collection a safe process. I already mentioned this, but the cheapest methods are seldom biosecure. Landfills don't really want dead animals, and if they take them, they have to do some special procedures to collect leakage and that sort of thing. Burial, way back when, and if we get to the questionnaire and you want to know, I can explain to you why sometimes they have to charge to pick them up, because it's all economics. But I remember way back when I was on the farm in the 60s, National Buy started charging to pick up that dead sow. Well, Dad was stubborn, so we were using a tractor and loader and burying that dead sow. I'm sure it cost us $50 to bury her, or $20 they would have picked her up. But anyway, it's not exactly a good option in a lot of areas. Composting is used and can, if done right, composting can be biosecure, but it's not often done right. And we have a lot of pictures, unfortunately, some of them in Iowa, with people putting carcasses of many different kinds of animals, including pigs, in places they don't belong and abandoning them. Obviously, that's a bad thing for the environment and bad thing for animal health. So that slide says the same thing I just said. All right. So dead stock, you know, when I was working for Iowa State, we also used National Byproducts, who, by the way, doesn't exist anymore. The plant's still here and in Clinton and different places in Iowa. They're now owned by Darling. But I thought that's what all rendering was picking up dead stuff and making stuff out of it. But actually, today, it's only 4% of all our raw material. 4%. So 96% of raw material is coming from food animals, USDA-inspected animals, so on and so forth. And that's a selling point when we're trying to talk about pet food. They don't want anything to do with any dead pigs. So it's... luckily, FDA has not changed their mind. They said 20-some years ago, and they're sticking with it. I talk to them about every week. But they say that dead stock, processed dead stock, is suitable for animal food if the preventing controls are present for the hazards. So we have all that research to show that the preventing controls do take care of those pathogenic hazards. And as I said, many pet food companies don't want it. And many mixed species plants that take some beef, they take some pork, they take butcher shop, so it's a mixed species protein meal. They are undervalued. So, Brian, when you're building rations, you might look at some of those plants or take a multi-species because it's the same product, but you can't label it just pork meal or just beef meal. Is what they want to do in pet food. So they're undervalued in the marketplace. As I said, it can be done safely. The trucks anymore are modern, specialized trucks that are biosecure and leaf-proof in most places. This is the producer's job in cooperation with the renderer, but you've got to have a line of separation. You can't allow that truck close to the barn. You need to have a repository for your dead stock across that line, and that rendering truck should not come on your side of the line. So you need some farm rules on that and need to be enforceable. Something like that would be a diagram. The red line, rendering truck should not come past that red line, and in some cases maybe not feed trucks either. So any kind of traffic, as you well know, needs to be analyzed for hazards. But the containers, should be bird-proof and rodent-proof and coyote-proof and so forth. And this can be done and is done in many places. Some places are actually putting them in refrigerated boxes or reefer trailers or whatever to also keep them fresh and get enough of an amount so that it doesn't cost so much to pick them up. When the rendering cook comes out, if they're only getting one pig, you got a lot of cost involved. If they're getting a whole load of pigs, it's a lot more economical. So dead animals can be collected safely. The practicality for a swine operation can only be determined in consultation between the rendering plant and the producer. You should have an agreement on these procedures. The mortality should be secured from the vectors and predators, and it's best if they're out of sight before they're picked up, because a lot of your neighbors don't want to see that either. Most of our rendering operations do routine truck washing, and when PERS was going around and PED was going around, PED is the one I should be remembering. Many of them put in extra biosecurity procedures in consultation with the producer to make sure that they weren't causing the problems. So they added wheel well washers and extra biosecurity methods when needed, something that will have to kick into place if we ever have African swine fever to deal with on some of our farms. So I mentioned I was on a couple of African swine fever task forces, and the reason is because rendering is always looked at as one of the options. I just told you about all the advantages to using it for disposal. So people say, well, if we have to put down 30,000 animals because of African swine fever, can you render all those? Well, that's a little different proposition, because that's a lot of material. Rendering is done. We have a lot of government regulations, but we have essentially no government support. There's no money that comes from any of these programs. So if they did participate in the disposal of depopulated animals because of a foreign disease, there would be it'd be their choice. So some renderers say they will, some renderers probably won't. So there's a number of questions, concerns, and impacts that need to be answered before that's assumed to be part of the disposal process for an animal disease. So we're working on plans. We're trying to figure it out. I've learned in some of these task forces that if you have an outbreak that's confirmed to be African swine fever, that there may be a number of herds in the area that don't have it, that have to be cleared out of the way to prevent spread or whatever. So there may be renders can participate without actually taking diseased animals, because you have all the customer concerns downstream if you do, even though it would be safe through the cooking process. So we're working on all that. Renders' concerns about this are biosecurity and the liability for potentially having an accident that if they happen to lose control over a truckload of carcasses with African swine fever. Transportation, many state vets believe that they should be burned, buried, or composted on the farm, and they shouldn't have trucks going up and down the road with these contaminated carcasses on them. So transportation would have to be done in a biosecure way, if at all. Some renders are concerned about their plant being contaminated with a certain virus, African swine fever virus, or any other controlled type of virus. What would it take to get back in operation? How long would they be quarantined before they could be back in producing pet food ingredients and whatnot? Perception and communication. We had a similar deal with. I was on board about 15 years ago when Virginia got hit with avian influenza, and the same conversations were taking place. We were trying to decide if rendering plants could take these depopulated turkeys and chickens, and so some of them checked with their customers. Well, some of their main customers were those very farms of turkeys and chickens. So we don't want that meat and bone meal here. We don't want that chicken meal here. That's been diseased. Well, it's fine. We cook it. No, we don't want it. So, the perception and communication on what risk might be involved in that material is a big deal. But even so, they might be able to render it and reduce the volume by, take 60% of the weight out in the water. You landfilling a sterile meal instead of a big carcass, be some advantage to that. But without a market, they'd obviously have to be paid to do it that way. So having a plan in place before an outbreak would be a good thing. We've been working on these plans for years. Hopefully we'll get one before I retire. What more could be done on dead stock? As I said, fallen animals or livestock that die anytime before slaughter is only about 4%. But we're not, that's not all of them. That may be half of them, because approximately 60% of the cattle that die each year are not rendered, because they're scattered all over these cow-calf areas, Florida, Texas, places that are quite remote. And they're not rendered. It would be good if they could be rendered, maybe with 60, 70 cent fat per pound. There'd be more incentives to render some of these animals that are either landfilled or left on the back 40 or something. In Europe, the local county governments will pay the render to pick up the dead stock. Somebody's got to pay for hiring the driver and paying for the truck and the fuel. So it does cost money to pick those up, and a little help would help the environment. If we got all the additional cattle that aren't rendered, that alone would be like taking 200,000 cars off the road. So there's more that could be done as far as rendering an environment with the right kind of incentives. I'm going to talk, I'm talking fast here. I'm going to talk a little bit about blood products, because that's done a little differently. Blood can be rendered in the same cooker I showed you, but some of it isn't. And there's some misconceptions about that, particularly in the last few years, specifically with PED, porcine epidemic diarrhea virus, back in 2013, 2014. Spray-dried blood plasma was viewed as a high-risk ingredient, was blamed for the spread of that disease. And about the same time, Dr. D, who's speaking in another room today, showed in research that various viruses could survive on feed ingredients, say from China or wherever. So those things taken together really kind of put these blood products in a bad light, unfairly, I might add. So the response of the industry, and many of the, even though it's not rendered, many of the companies that do this are members of our association. So a lot of times nobody else is representing these byproducts, so I try to do my best. But so I was involved in some of this, but the industry had the University of Minnesota do a risk assessment. Multiple hurdles were defined and validated as to ways that this stuff is safe, even though it's not cooked at those high temperatures. And there was further investigation of PED outbreaks. Unfortunately, the Canadians got a paper published right away that said the cause of this is plasma meal. That was in 2014, and that causes a lot of problems because we think they jumped to conclusions. We think there's a lot of factors they didn't consider. So along with the people at APC, represented over here, and some of their scientists and myself and others, we went back and looked at risk factors that they didn't consider then. And there were a number of them, and I'm not going to go through all of them, but the abstract's available. Things like trucks were coming from infected herds in the U.S., going right to Canada and working up there without being washed. The index case in Canada that they thought was the index case wasn't. They had it much earlier than that in herds that never used plasma. So many factors that tell us that that was a wrong conclusion are in this paper. Now here's a better list than what I just tried to remember. But it was in Canada before the index case, minimal cleaning of trucks coming from the U.S., PED virus contaminated imported non-feed ingredients introduced PDV in Canada, and there's no support for the suggestion that, well, they just didn't manufacture it right, they didn't follow their procedures. I'll tell you what, there's not, I don't think there's a feed ingredient anywhere in pet food or anything else that is more meticulously manufactured than spray-dried blood plasma. They can trace it back to where it came from. They have all these hurdles. So that breach in the practices just didn't happen either. So our conclusion is that in the U.S. was that ingredients had a negligible to very low association with PED. Anyway, since all that, and with that results of that research and the response, plasma producers have invested significant resources into researching different technologies and different things on making sure that product is safe. Now, you know, cooking is easy, and we have, I went through the process and how we cook things to 245 to 290 degree F when we're rendering them. Well, the advantages to plasma meal is that it's a functional protein, so it has things to offer pigs over and above the protein, and it won't offer those things if you cook it too much. So you break down those proteins, you break down the functions they can do. So then it's just protein. It's not functional protein. So they process it a little differently and doesn't reach those high temperatures, but it's every bit as safe. So I will show you a little data on that. The University of Minnesota risk assessment was paid for and commissioned by a couple of our companies, a couple of our members that do this work. And they looked at 3 different inactivation hurdles that are done in these plants: spray drying, and then post-drying heat treatment, and then an additional hurdle, either ultraviolet light or more dry heat at the end. So they have all kinds of data on these things, and I'm not going to go into a super lot of detail on it, but it's very methodical. And I believe this is on APC's website, or you can get it from me, but it's a step-by-step way that they make sprayed by blood plasma, one of our important byproducts. And I've got a few more slides here. All right. This is a blood processing room at one of the pork slaughter facilities. Now, before they started doing this, they'd stick the pigs on the line, the blood would fall on the floor into a kind of a gutter, and the gutter would go someplace where they'd pump it out into a ring dryer. And that still happens in some plants. And those temperatures are high enough that you don't worry about that. But at these lower temperatures, you don't do it that way. This blood is collected aseptically, so it's much like a human food would be treated. Never touches the floor. It's collected, immediately pumped into dedicated blood processing room. It's separated, the plasma from the cells, and it's chilled right away. More detail here on all the various steps. You'll see they're all clean. The middle flow chart shows processing area, raw area. There's very limited crossover without sanitation. Good clean operations. This inset here is some of the ultraviolet treatment that they'll put it through. A series of tubes where it's spread out thin so the light can kill whatever pathogen is probably not there anyway. Color-coded system in those plants so the wrong colored uniform doesn't end up in the wrong place. Sanitation stations, if they do have to cross over. Already showed you that slide. Just a really clean, well-controlled operation. This is a picture of the warehouse. This stuff is then packaged and put in a warehouse with time, date stamps and so forth. They'll have a sentinel. Where's my sentinel? Yeah. They'll take one of those pallets, put temperature sensors inside of it, and watch it for the full time it's in there, so the temperature is not just the air temperature in the room, but the product stays the correct temperature for the correct amount of time. So very highly controlled. So it's a multiple hurdle technology, almost done. And even though a single hurdle may not reach the log reduction as they're cooking, you put 2 or 3 of them together and they easily reach the same level of product protection. This graph shows a bunch of them. I mean, they did work on PRRS virus, swine influenza virus, PED, swine vesicular disease, classical swine fever, African swine fever, and so forth. Some of these aren't done yet, but even on the ones that aren't done, just 2 of the hurdles add up to log reductions well into the teens, over 10, and that's a very safe product. Another thing they do is they have traceability and keep track of all the stuff's in the warehouse. They go back to all the regions that the blood came from. If any of those regions ever broke with African swine fever, that product would not be marketed. So there's multiple hurdles, and then there's a final screen check with the region it came from to make sure that they don't spread disease. Thank you. I'll take questions.
And if you could hold your questions until you have the wireless mic.
I should have mentioned, Jan Bin Shen and Joe Crenshaw are here. If you have questions about plasma, ask them, because I just told you everything I know.
Are there any questions for the speaker?
You mentioned before between National Bioproducts and Darling. Do you see any more competition in dead disposal pickup at all, or is it just going to be kind of dominated by Darling?
Well, there's any one area probably just has one option. I mean, in northern part of the state, you have Santa Max and you have Worthington and you have a Central Buy up in Minnesota. So northern part of the state, there's probably some competition. But yeah, you're probably stuck with Darling. But I think they're a pretty good firm.
Ago. So, thank you.
We have time for probably one or two more questions. I was wondering, did COVID affect your output of product or your clients?
Well, COVID affected your industry, the pork industry, so it did affect us. The plants I showed you are operated by just a few people, so it's easy for them to stay apart. So we didn't have any shutdowns in rendering, except the ones that were in the pork plant that shut down. Because when they shut down part of the plant, they shut down the whole plant. So we never had a plant shut down. In fact, we had some rendering operations that assisted with the depopulation and took a lot of whole animals that they don't normally take, just to help with the glut. And I figured, including North Carolina and Minnesota and Iowa and some in Nebraska, we probably rendered 1 million pigs because of the COVID pandemic that couldn't go to slaughter. So we were involved, but we really didn't have many. We had some employees get sick, and a good friend of mine actually died from COVID, but we didn't have any shutdowns.
All right, then let's go ahead and thank our speaker.